plugin of the week is the LSR VLB902. This is an emulation of the classic DeEsser made by DBX, the 902 DeEsser. If we go back in history, DBX created in the early 80s a 900 series rack. You're probably more familiar with the 500 series racks created by API, but this was a 900 series rack, so around a similar time. And they had a whole series of components. They had a 903, which was a compressor, the 902, which is a DeEsser. You can see that unit right here. They had a 905, which was a parametric EQ. They had a gate module, a flanger module. They had a couple of noise reduction modules. This one was quite popular, which was the single-ended noise reduction channels. And these were used for eliminating tape hiss. So if you had like too much hiss on a vocal, then you could work with that. So they had a whole series of different components. This one here, the 933, was a little mixer, like a little sub-mixer, which is kind of an interesting thing for the time. So let's take a look at the actual plugin itself. So the plugin itself, as you can see here on the left-hand side, this is the basic component you see on the rack mount, and there's an additional section on the side here that offers a couple of features that were not part of the original. Essentially, you have an in and out switch, pretty straightforward. You have two different modes that you can operate in. In the high frequency only mode, what ends up happening is that it will only apply the compression, fast attack, fast release compression, to the high frequencies, and that cutoff point or that crossover point is determined by the frequency control right here. Otherwise, it will operate and apply the gain reduction full bandwidths on full frequency. So depending upon what it is that you're doing, you may find one more effective than the other. The frequency here selects the crossover point or cutover point. So it actually has a pretty broad range, going down as low as 800 cycles, which gets a little bit more into the boxy kind of area, all the way up to 8K, which gets you up to a pretty broad upper range in terms of frequencies. There is a range control, and this will determine the amount of gain reduction. Now, what's really unique about the 902 DeEsser that's very different from any other DeEsser that I've seen is that the way that it reacts is not based on levels. So you notice that there's no threshold here. So what it's doing is it's taking the signal above the frequency selection here, so at that crossover point, and it measures the differential between that frequency content and the rest of the frequency content. And where it finds there's an imbalance, then it applies the de-essing. So this is a different thing. Whereas today, most DeEsser plugins and the way that you work with most DeEssers is that they will work on a threshold principle. So you will need to put them typically after your compression, or if you have a couple of stages of compression, put it after so that the level of your vocal is pretty consistent so that the threshold will work consistently on the vocal itself. So what you'll find is that this will react to more than just the S's. It'll also act on other frequency, elements like CHs that also cut through, Fs, which sometimes cut through, and you'll kind of see that in the example here. So it operates on other parts of words where that high frequency content kind of cuts through, and it's mostly about that differential that I was just discussing. So one of the things that's really cool that didn't exist on the original is that we have a detector circuit, and this allows us to measure or listen to the crossover point. So we can kind of do that, and then we could also hear the de-essed signal. So we could hear just what is being removed or just what's being limited. So we'll start with a little bypass just so we can hear what the original vocal is like, and then we'll kind of pick up from there.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you.
So right there in the very beginning, you can hear a little bit of some of the, especially that first word, the very first thing that cuts through is pretty harsh. So let's switch over to the detector signal now here, bypass, and then let's hear the crossover now.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me.
So you can hear how that gets down into the boxy kind of marbly kind of sound.
You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here before it goes wrong. Don't you know you can't keep run?
Let's go back to the beginning.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail.
Let's cut back a little bit.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid.
Right, so we kind of find like a good area there where the S's are more or less where the higher frequency content is sort of cutting through. So it's a little bit higher. You don't get an exact frequency here, but probably close to 3K. It's usually a little bit lower than I go, but it actually, for this, it kind of works for this particular vocal. It has a little bit of a harshness in there that's a little bit lower than a more typical 4 or 5K starting area. And then we can also listen to just the S's. So you can hear actually just the parts that are being removed. So it's very cool. And then we can hear the full process signal afterwards. Now, we could operate, and we'll just kind of A/B some of the two different modes here. When you work with the range control, it starts at 0, and then it works away. There's sort of a normal range here, where you would get a normal amount of processing, and then it goes all the way up to 20 dB. So you could get really aggressive and pretty heavy-handed with it. So let's just kind of start here, and let's just see what we can get.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here.
And what you'll find here is, even with just a couple of dB, you get a pretty smooth sound. Sometimes I think there is, when you're going in, especially to higher frequencies, you can sometimes get more gain reduction overall, or you need that to kind of get more of the effect. And just to kind of show you how aggressive it can be, I'm going to just crank this up a little bit.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid.
And then you can hear that if I switch it to full frequency mode.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid.
And you can hear it ducking, whereas with the high frequency mode, it's really just operating on the higher frequencies.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid.
And even though it's some really heavy gain reduction there, there's a smoothness to it or character to it that is sort of unique. This is a classic, from the early 80s. This is kind of the go-to DeEsser for most people. Most studios would have this in their rack and use this for their de-essing for vocals. Some of them would fill out one of those whole 10-space racks just with DBX 902s if you had stacks of background vocals and things like that that also needed to be de-essed. Sometimes people would put them, multiples of them in a row on the vocal chain if there were really heavy sibilance problems. But with here, this has got some pretty, heavy harshness in it, but let's kind of get not too heavy-handed, but, enough that we can kind of cut back on it a little bit and then compensate a little bit afterwards.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you.
So we can get there almost to the point where, not quite at a point where it's getting to be a lisp, but pretty close. But then what I could do here is I can just kind of put in a little pull tick there on the top end to bring some of the air back in. And let's hear.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here before it goes wrong. Don't you know you can't.
And what you get is a pretty smooth, even kind of character with it. It's a very cool thing, and there are no other emulations of this that I know of. There may be some that are out there, but it is definitely a very unique one, and one that was used widely on almost all records, or any record that needed de-essing. This was one of the best that was out there in terms of that type of work, and a good job by LSR to do an emulation of this, a classic de-esser, the DBX 902. So this is the by LSR Audio, the VLB 902 de-esser from the 900 series racks made by DBX in the early 1980s.